3 true scary stories to fall asleep to. Tonight, let's listen to 3 ghostly and creepy stories that may give you the chills. So jump in the bed, put your headphones in, and don't be too scared to sleep. I live in Central California, in the valley, bordered on all sides by hills and mountain ranges. There are some great hikes and campgrounds all around, and my ex and I chose to go hiking in the Sespe Wilderness. It's about a 2-hour drive from home, and it's basically hiking in the mountains southwest of Bakersfield off the highway that leads to Ojai and the coast. Gorgeous country, very remote, no cell service. Both archaeology hobbyists, we decide to hike out past Piedras Blancas, a giant rock formation, and keep on that same trail, paralleling the Sespe Creek, in order to look for some Chumash pictographs. It's about a 5-mile hike, hilly terrain, full of scrub brush and smaller trees. The trail is well maintained, and we're mostly alone out there. We reach an old campground about 3 to 4 miles out and I'm feeling tired, so I stop to rest at the campground. The campground is pretty much circular. There are several different campsites all in plain view of one another, and just to the east there's a large rock formation that overlooks the creek. The rock formation is kind of flat, so I go over and lay down on the warm rocks so I can listen to the water. He decides to continue further along the trail to see if he can locate the pictographs. I don't know how much time had passed when I hear the strangest howling scream I've ever heard. It went on for longer than a human should have been able to scream, and it alternated in from being very low and guttural to high-pitched like a woman. So I shoot up off the rock and start looking around, and I don't see anything. The sound didn't repeat, and I started to think that maybe I was just hearing an animal. All of a sudden he comes crashing back down the trail at full speed, thinking that he's hearing me screaming. He describes hearing it a little differently. That sounds I heard were not the sound he heard, but we both agree we heard something very strange and can't explain it. We both decide that it's time to head back, and the sun was starting to set, and it was late afternoon. We were walking back on the trail parallel to the creek, when we started to hear boulders being thrown in the water. If you've ever been a kid by a body of water, you know what it feels like to pick up the heaviest rock you can, and toss it into the water, and hear the sound that heavy rocks make. This was heavier than that, and we knew it. We heard it several times, following us along the trail, and crashing sounds in the brush from across the creek. Whatever was throwing the rocks was following us, making sure we knew we weren't welcome. I have no idea what type of animal could throw very large boulders in the water like that. If it was a human, they did a damn fine job of pranking us, because we were terrified. We hurried as fast as we could. I ended up slipping on the trail and falling to the ground, spraining my ankle. My ex helped me up, and we made our way back to the parking lot near dark. I went online and only found one other post about strange things happening in the Sespe Creek wilderness. We still don't know what we heard that day. This happened about 2 years ago, and I've been a full believer since then. Up until that point, I always liked the idea of the supernatural. I enjoy horror movies and late-night Wikipedia rabbit holes, but it was never anything I took very seriously. So like I said, about 2 years ago, my grandma and I drove up to Weatherford, Texas for my aunt's baby shower one weekend. I was excited because we were staying in this historic bed and breakfast that was this gorgeous Victorian house, and those are always my favorite. The baby shower came and went, and my grandma and I were winding down for the night in our room. I was leafing through one of the bedside pamphlets that spoke of the history of the building and some of the hauntings it was rumored to have. It was mildly entertaining, but I didn't take it too seriously. Just really sounded like any other haunting those older hotels boast about. I fell asleep and I soon began to dream. And in my dream I wake up in the same bed and have this urge to walk out into the hallway in front of the stair landing. The stairs themselves of this place are these big old wooden carvings with stained glass in the windows. And in my dream there's a woman standing in a white dress on these stairs, with the colored reflections of the stained glass on her. She looked ethereal almost, but more than anything I remember suddenly being overcome with this overwhelming sadness. Just pure despair and melancholy. Suddenly I wake up in my bed and I've been crying, but as I come to I notice I'm feeling this really tight squeeze on my heel. Almost like a full fist covering the back of my foot, and just increasingly adding pressure. As soon as I become fully awake and pull my foot, it disappears. I'm a little freaked out, but I eventually drift back to sleep and have normal dreams. The next morning I'm waking up when my grandmother starts talking about her night. She starts telling me how she had a dream with a woman, and she just felt so overcome with this sorrow that she thought was never going to end, and as she came to from the dream, she felt someone pulling on her big toe under the sheet, and as she became fully awake, it disappeared. My grandma just about had a heart attack when I told her almost the same thing happened to me. I moved to V-Town around the time I turned 13. My father was in the military, and we quickly outgrew base housing, which led he and my mother to buy a duplex in V-Town. It was a small town, dusty and run down, but with some charm left over still. Our house was on Main Street, and behind it sat a creek that ran under a bridge and into a dam. After a month or so of living in V-Town, I realized that while this town functioned normally on the surface, underneath it was buzzing with heavy and dark air, too thick for me to breathe. We lived in V-Town for 4 years, and while I did have some good times, I can only recall being miserable and scared most of the time. I still have nightmares of being locked in my old room, not being able to breathe or speak, trying desperately to hide from the invisible. My family and I refer to the years we spent in that house as the forgotten years. We all have trouble remembering our time, but we can remember some bits and pieces. Sometimes we'll sit and compare stories, remembering but still trying to forget. I wish I could put my experiences in chronological order, but living in that house seemed like a timeless loop. There are some events that I can vividly recall. My father and siblings had gone to visit a family member, so Mom and I were vegging out on late-night TV after giving the house a deep cleaning. We both heard a loud crash from upstairs and immediately grabbed a plastic lightsaber and pre-dialed 911. We went to investigate my brother's room and found a large toy across the room, clearly no longer in the toy chest where we had placed it earlier that evening. That was one of many loud crashes and instances of things being thrown. My little brother Danny hated his room. It was in the attic, across the landing from my bedroom. My brother spent most nights at that house sleeping in my bed. My other 2 siblings spent several nights a week curled up in bed with Danny and I as well. This went on for most of the time we lived in V-Town. Danny would complain that something was scratching under his bed and at the wall space above his head. One night he came into my room, tears streaming down his face and bloody scratches swelling on his upper back. He regularly chewed his nails down to the quick. There was no explanation. There was never an explanation. I also experienced the scratching under my bed on the rare nights that I slept in my room alone. I would hear voices, see wretched faces drifting around my head, and my bed would shake. Those nights were the worst. I would have concluded that I was losing my mind if I was the only one seeing and feeling these things. I often had a little boy visit me outside the door of my room. He would sit outside the cracked door and watch my siblings and I sleep. My sister and I saw him once when both our little brothers were sleeping soundly on the floor next to my bed. I remember crying because I felt like I needed to protect that little boy from the evil in our house. My whole family refused to enter the unfinished basement due to the growling noise that floated around your head and followed you back up the stairs. My youngest brother Elliot would see men in top hats standing outside our shed in the backyard. We later found out that in the past, it had been utilized as an ice house. It was built by the town milkman who had also built our home. The milkman would cut giant cubes of ice from the creek behind our house and pack the small building with ice, sawdust, and hay. It was the town's source of ice for the warmer months. It was revealed to us by a local history buff that the small crawl space we played in underneath the ice house was where the town people had stored their deceased in winter, until the ground was soft enough to dig a grave in. We had several neighbors commit suicide in the years we spent in V-Town. The whole town felt like it had a heavy cloud of negative energy, and to me it felt like it all stemmed from the dam, 300 feet from our house. I remember sitting on the edge of the dam and staring at the vicious, black, frothy water, trying to decide if it was worth slipping over the edge into, like several residents of V-Town had done before me. My father retired from the military when I was 17. We quickly relocated to upstate New York, and the V-Town house was on the market for 6 months. It ended up getting foreclosed on, like many of the historical but rundown houses that filled our town. A month after the house had been foreclosed on, I drove back to V-Town to visit a few friends. We came up with a terrible idea of spending the night in that house to try and capture something. One of the glass panels on the front door had been replaced with plastic, and I easily popped the panel out to unlock the front door and break in. Including myself, there were 4 of us. We camped out in my old bedroom and set up a simple voice recorder. It was as if the house was rebelling against our presence. We heard dishes breaking, stomping up and down the multiple staircases, and growling in the abandoned house. I felt like I held my breath the entire time we were there. When we heard laughing and knocking, We decided we'd had enough, and it was time to get the hell out. We packed our sleeping bags back up and fled the house. We were there for a total of 5 hours. I'm not sure what happened to the voice recorder after that night. Sometimes I wish I could remember every creepy thing that occurred in that house, because it's odd to have chunks missing from my life like that. But honestly, I'm glad I don't. Dealing with the trauma that I incurred helped me discover that I'm an empath who's very sensitive to the paranormal, more specifically to energy imprints. I do still have experiences anywhere I live, as does my family, but nothing will ever compare to the constant feelings of horror and dread we had in the V-Town house. Wow, you guys are the best. My Demons and Devils video is killing it. Thanks for supporting the channel, and make sure you stab that like button. Also, if you want a second video of Demons and Devils, comment down below. And if you want more horror stories, check out a true and disturbing horror story right here.